Let's continue here.
Of American history. Again, Lizzo did both, and only one of those clips went viral. And so if you notice that, then you're very, very bad. If you notice that, then this means that you're some sort of racist, or it means that you don't want black people playing the flute or something. No, I just don't want people twerking with historic instruments.
To put out a list of which instruments you're allowed to twerk with, shake your booty with, or whatever it is that he finds to be offensive. This is so, like, my God. Continue.
Lizzo would do that, right? Lizzo is enough of a musician to understand the nature of historic musical pieces of art. And so the degradation of that, like, why doesn't she personally have the respect for the instrument and respect for the history enough not to twerk with it?
And this was a gift to James Madison from a French crystal flute designer to celebrate his second term. There was a fire when he was away, and the only two things that were saved was a portrait of George Washington and this crystal flute right here.
Every day on this show, there's some clip that is taken that is utterly uncontroversial and then made into a thing on Twitter.
Oh my God. Yeah, every day on this show, I play a clip and I outrage over it, even though there is no reason at all to be offended. But I do it every day for clicks.
Have the respect for the instrument and respect for the history enough not to twerk with it.
Where have you been?
Where haven't I been? Woof!
Nathaniel, we're leaving. And you?
Yes?
Has anyone ever told you you're a giggling imbecile?
Oh, yes.
Good riddance, you old witch. Oh, she's forgotten her broomstick.
And by the way, the left would have the same exact reaction if somebody took the Mona Lisa off the wall at the Louvre and then went and twerked with it at some sort of rock
I'd
event.
literally
They'd have exactly the same reaction, because degradation of the past, degradation of great art is part and parcel of something that the deconstructionist left love.
Fed to the teeth with all of these elevated things, old dead legends. Why must we go on forever, writing only about gods and legends?
Because they do. They go on forever. That is what they represent. The eternal in us. Opera is here to ennoble us, Mozart. You and me, just the same as His Majesty.
Bello, veramente.
Oh, bello. Come on now, be honest. Which one of you wouldn't rather listen to his hairdresser than Hercules? Or Horatius, or Orpheus. People so lofty they sound as if they shit marble.
What? Govern your tongue, Mozart. How dare you?
Amadeus Mozart was contemporary to the U.S. War of Independence, where American colonies honored the great tradition of authoritarian rule by the world's richest man and his pet corporation by dumping it for a republic, itself shaped by the experience of centuries of religious and social conflict in Europe. It is exactly because of history I think these guys are extremely foolish. Your boys Ben and Dennis choose some very strange allies to shepherd into power.
Catholics were put on the court to overturn Roe versus Wade, and Jews stood in the way. If Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a Jew, on the Supreme Court, if she didn't die last year so that Amy Coney Barrett, a Catholic woman, could be appointed in her place, Roe versus Wade would still be the law of the land. Think about that. If Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a Jewish woman, didn't die last year so that Amy Coney Barrett, a Catholic woman, could be appointed to the bench, we would still have Roe versus Wade. Now you tell me that this is a Judeo-Christian country. Now you tell me that this is a Judeo-Christian movement. You tell me that it doesn't matter that you have a lot of these Jewish people in government. Tell me that it doesn't matter after a decision like this. Because of that change, because we had a Jewish woman and now we have a Catholic woman. Tell me religion doesn't matter. Tell me that this dispute between Judeo and Christian doesn't matter. It absolutely matters. It makes all the difference. Clearly. This is why it's Christian nationalism. We need a government of Christians.
I still marvel at individuals like Ben or Dennis, who's actually trained in history, that they seem to have forgotten A lot of it.
Christianity emerged from Judaism. Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew who preached a singular religious message. The first Christians were Jews who prayed in Hebrew and observed the customs and religious rituals of Judaism. Jesus was put to death at the hands of Roman authorities under Pontius Pilate in Judea, but the gospel accounts were interpreted as blaming all Jews for the crucifixion. To his followers, Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah. His death, sacrificial atonement. Most Jews believed the Messiah had not yet come. Redemption was not at hand. By the 5th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. The early Christian church portrayed Jews as unwilling to accept the word of God. Illuminations showed Satan binding the eyes of the Jews. Some church leaders intensified the charge, condemning Jews as agents of the devil and murderers of God.
Blood libel is associated these days with anti-Semitism. Originally a myth set of prehistoric societies, it was later frequently attached to early Christians in the Roman Empire. The early church fathers adopted it to vilify heretics and their followers, and it seems to have been a handy club to use since.
This is about to get graphic and kinky, so just heads up, we'll start in Panarion 26:4-1. But I shall get right down to the worst part of the deadly description of them, for they vary in their wicked teaching of what they please, which is, first of all, that they hold their wives in common. And if a guest who is of their persuasion arrives, they have a sign that men give women and women give men, a tickling of the palms as they clasp hands in supposed greeting, to show that the visitor is of their religion. And once they recognize each other from this, they start feasting right away, and they set the table with lavish provisions for eating meat and drinking wine, even if they are poor. But then, after a drinking bout and, let us say, stuffing their overstuffed veins, they get hot for each other next, and the husband will move away from his wife and tell her, speaking to his own wife, "Get up, perform the agape with the brother." Oh my. For after having made love with the passion of fornication, in addition to lift their blasphemy up to heaven, the woman and man receive the man's emission on their own hands, and they stand with their eyes raised heavenward, but the filth on their hands, and pray, if you please, the ones they call stratiotics and Gnostics, and offer that stuff on their hands to the true Father of all, and say, "We offer thee this gift, the body of Christ." And then they eat it, partaking of their own dirt, and saying, "This is the body of Christ, and this is the Pascha, because of which our bodies suffer and are compelled to acknowledge the passion of Christ." And so with the woman's emission, when she happens to be having her period, they likewise take the unclean menstrual blood they gather from her and eat it in common. And this, they say, is the blood of Christ. All right, yeah, I guess that's one way to perform the Eucharist. Apparently, though, this group had even more special ways of doing that, skipping ahead to 5:4. But even though one of them should accidentally implant the seed of his natural emission prematurely and the woman becomes pregnant, listen to a more dreadful thing that such people venture to do. They extract the fetus at the stage which is appropriate for their enterprise, take this aborted infant and cut it up in a trough with a pestle, and they mix honey, pepper, and certain other perfumes and spices with it to keep from getting sick, and then all the revelers in this herd of swine and dogs assemble, and each eats a piece of the child with his fingers. And now, after this cannibalism, they pray to God and say, "We are not mocked by the archon of lust, but have gathered the brothers' blunder up." And this, if you please, is their idea of the perfect Passover. So, I have a question. Epiphanius, how exactly did you come to know all of this?
And of course, we can't leave out witch trials, which had a very distinguished history both in the US and in Europe.
In the German town of Nördlingen in 1593, an innkeeper named Maria Hull found herself accused of witchcraft. She was arrested for questioning and denied the charges. She continued to insist she wasn't a witch through 62 rounds of torture before her accusers finally released her. Rebecca Lemp, accused a few years earlier in the same town, faced a worse fate. She wrote to her husband from jail, worrying that she would confess under torture, even though she was innocent. After giving a false confession, she was burned at the stake in front of her family. Hull and Lemp were both victims of the witch hunts that occurred in Europe and the American colonies from the late 15th century until the early 18th century. These witch hunts were not a unified initiative by a single authority, but rather a phenomenon that occurred sporadically and followed a similar pattern each time.
Witch trials didn't completely die out. There was the 1950s.
Imagine that one day you're summoned before a government panel. Even though you haven't committed any crime or been formally charged with one, you are repeatedly questioned about your political views, accused of disloyalty, and asked to incriminate your friends and associates. If you don't cooperate, you risk jail or losing your job. This is exactly what happened in the United States in the 1950s as part of a campaign to expose suspected communists. Named after its most notorious practitioner, the phenomenon known as McCarthyism destroyed thousands of lives and careers.
Conservatives are, if anything, sticklers for tradition. Certainly Ben Dennis and their comrades at arms are helping them along, each in their own special way. What isn't clear is if Christian nationalism will stop short of excluding non-Christians. One day, bells may toll for non-Christians, the next for heretical faiths. So Ben and Dennis seem to be pretty comfortable with the Christian nationalist movement. They certainly never complain about it. I hope they're comfortable with the idea that that movement might decide to turn on the Jewish community or on other Christian denominations as heretics. And I think it's relevant now to speak on or cover a little bit of that kind of history as it played out in Europe.
War in the name of God. The great world religions preach peace and mercy. History, even modern history, shows that religion and violence are not contradictions. In the 16th century, there emerges a new Christian denomination. Latin Christianity, already separated from the Orthodox Church of the East, splits once more into Catholics and Protestants. And in the name of Christ, they go to war against each other in the bloodiest conflict that Europe has ever known.
Martin Luther was one of a host of reforming voices, but it was his writings that lit the tinder of mass discontent as the German feudal system unraveled and secular princes supported Reformation, all too happy to confiscate a bit of church property as their own, as the Holy Roman Church owned 1/3 of the land.
His translation of the Bible into German is the one that really takes off, really catches fire.
A fire that Luther has not intended. His religious texts are understood as an inspiration to revolution. Thomas Müntzer debates with Luther and summons up forces that he can no longer control.
I do not come bringing peace, but the sword.
He who lives by
Matthew
the sword
10.
shall die by the sword. Matthew 26.
Initially sympathetic towards the insurgents, Luther then calls on the ruling princes to adopt stern measures in his tract against the thieving and murderous hordes of peasants. He does not wish to be associated with the brutalities of the peasants, and unlike Müntzer, he does not want a revolution.
Bauernkrieg, das ist ja ein...
The Peasants' War is just a name, and it gives the wrong impression. There wasn't a war as we understand the term, rather an unknown number of isolated uprisings.
But what the princes actually do is also not what Luther intended. Luther suffers under the Reformation as much as he influences it. He has no control over events. The Reformation attracts fanatics. Revolt against the clergy spreads like wildfire. Iconoclasts attack churches. In Munster, for a few bizarre months, Anabaptists rule a totalitarian state. They demand common ownership of property and prohibit marriage. When the riots are suppressed, the corpses of the ringleaders are displayed in cages.
Reformation continued to spread and diversify along with peasant revolts over another 40 years before the partisan strife was settled in 1555 with the Treaty of Augsburg. Here, the Holy Roman Emperor and Lutheran princes agreed to legalize two denominations of Christianity within the empire, allowing rulers to choose for themselves, and of course for their subjects, between Lutheranism or Catholicism. In turn, this settlement didn't last much beyond 50 years, not least because the Anabaptists and Calvinists, another denomination, were not included in the treaty. The war is conventionally held to have begun in 1618 when the future Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II attempted to impose Catholic absolutism on his domains, and the Protestant nobles of both Bohemia and Austria rose up in rebellion. The principal battlefield for all these intermittent conflicts was the towns and principalities of Germany, which suffered severely. During the 30 Years' War, many of the contending armies were mercenaries, many of whom could not collect their pay. This threw them on the countryside for their supplies. The armies of both sides plundered as they marched, leaving cities, towns, villages, and farms ravaged. Estimates suggest that 20% of Europe's people perished, with some areas seeing their population fall by as much as 60%. And the 30 Years' War wasn't the only thing going on. It was simply probably one of the most devastating of many conflicts. You had the 80 Years' War, the War of Mantuan Succession, the Franco-Spanish War, the Portuguese Restoration War, and 3 English Civil Wars.
The cost of the war, the destruction of a continent. The conflict over the right interpretation of Christianity leads to an orgy of cruelty which takes human beings to the brink of the abyss. The accepted worldview is damaged forever. A symbol of this is the gallows tree from which even wounded comrades, now useless as soldiers, are hanged.
But one of the outcomes of this massive tragedy was the beginnings of our concept of the modern state and of the concepts of separating religious from secular power. A comment to make about Luther and the Reformation is that he certainly did not want the conflict that his writings caused. And there's a point to this, that while certain figures may want to change or fix society in their mind, that there are others in it that might take up those ideas and take them in a completely different direction.
Marjorie Taylor Greene was on the stump for GOP gubernatorial candidate from Michigan Tudor Dixon, along with Donald Trump, and during her speech, she said something so egregious, so reckless, so deeply dangerous that I can't not think that she is literally trying to incite a civil war in the United States. Take a look.
We're all targets now, though, for daring to push back against the regime, and it doesn't stop at a weaponized legal system. I'm not going to mince words with you all. Democrats want Republicans dead, and they've already started the killings.
I would say that Marjorie Taylor Greene isn't trying to incite a war. She is stating that one is underway, that the Dem Party is engaged in a pogrom, that any altercation between a Dem or even a leftist or whatever else occurs to her and a Republican is an act of this campaign. And around here is the rest of the conservative media amplifying the concept of a deviant movement on the attack. The largest problem with such passion is its chaos. One day it's transgender targeted. The next Jews are packed off to Israel to fight Judgment Day, and a bunch of nutter evangelicals have the new codes. I don't think you can really know. And self-proclaimed Lutheran figures may very well start something they will get caught up in. The observant may have noticed the Jordan Peterson cameo throughout this video. I wanted to save him up for something he said, because it caught my attention when I first heard it, and now I think it should be of interest.
I spent a lot of time at the various universities I was associated with studying motivation for atrocity, because I was very curious about that as a psychologist, not as a sociologist or an economist or a political scientist. You're an Auschwitz guard. Okay, what's motivating you as an individual? And I wanted to understand it well enough so that I could understand how I could do that, because one answer to that is, well, that sort of behavior is so far beyond the pale that it's completely incomprehensible. It's just a manifestation of, say, like intense psychopathy, and a normal person can't even imagine it. And I think, that evidence doesn't really suggest that, because it isn't obvious that all the people involved in the Nazi movement, for example, were criminally pathological, that they were deviations, like incomprehensible deviations from the norm. It'd be lovely to think that, and it would make the world a lot simpler, but I think the evidence mostly suggests that no, you can get ordinary people to do that sort of thing, and maybe even to enjoy it. And so that's pretty bloody terrifying. And so I tried to understand that, and I think I did to some degree, although we can't go into that. A fair bit of that's a consequence of envy. It's the spirit of Cain.
His entire delivery here is bizarre, not only for the suggestion that he learned Nazi methods well enough out of a sense of revenge, but also the idea that extreme deference to authority is a mystery. The behavior was experimentally validated with the Stanford prisoner experiment, and this result has been taught in high school psychology courses for decades. Even the briefest dip here in history demonstrates people's predilection to violence and the cultural bulwarks used to diminish it.